He grew during the war as a military commander, but at the beginning, he showed a considerable degree of incompetency. For instance, at the Battle of Long Island, he left the end of his line open. The British were able to run around it, then nearly catch his whole army and destroy it.
Washington barely escaped. The British chased him. At Kips Bay, halfway up Manhattan, he watched his men break and run.
Washington was so shocked and outraged at the behavior of his men that he refused to leave the battlefield. He stood his ground. He thought his men were supposed to fight. So his aides actually had to come back to the scene of battle and to pull him off of the battlefield.
Washington seethed at the loss of New York. Then he and the British danced a deadly two-step up and down Manhattan Island. A skirmish at Harlem Heights. A defeat for Washington at White Plains. A disaster for Washington at Fort Washington. Another disaster at Fort Lee. The city was in flames. Washington thanked Providence or some enterprising rebel arsonist for doing what he should have done in the first place. By November, his army had almost evaporated. Men had left or deserted to bring in harvests. Thousands had been captured or killed. Others had fallen ill. And the British were chasing his remnant of 5,000 across the New Jersey plain.
By the end of 1776, the Continental Army was melting away. The jig seemed just about up. Washington was in despair. He started to talk about having to go hide out in the West.
To his cousin, Washington wrote, "I see the impossibility of serving with reputation. I was never in such an unhappy state since I was born." To his brother, he wrote, "I think the game is pretty near up."
By December of 1776, the Continental cause was in very serious trouble. Washington's soldiers were about to go home. Their enlistments were expiring. Many colonists were beginning to take up the British offer of pardon. They were going over to the enemy. The revolution was unraveling.
Washington was fighting a political battle at home and abroad. He realized that if he could not last long enough to cause the British people to tire of the war, he would lose all that he had built in 44 years. Somehow, he had to endure.
In fact, that was the best strategy for winning this war. Wear the enemy down over a long period of time. It was the strategy he practiced, but reluctantly. It seems that he never fully embraced it or understood that this was the way to win. And then, suddenly, at the very end of the year, in a bold and daring move, Washington, with his small remaining army, swooped down on Trenton, New Jersey.
There are few places in America where history pivots around the character of a single man. Washington crossing at the Delaware is one of them. When Washington turned here, the tide turned with him. But he turned not only on the enemy, he turned inward as well. Defeat and humiliation had forced him to confront all that had driven him throughout his life. And he saw that reputation meant something brutally simple. It had nothing to do with a royal commission or a big house on the Potomac. It was built upon a man's willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause. The watchword he had chosen for the Trenton attack was victory or death. They began moving at dusk on Christmas night. By 3 the next morning, 2,400 American troops had crossed the Delaware River in the middle of a sleet storm. There was confusion on the road to Trenton. Units were lost, timetables were missed, but the genius of Washington's plan was in the date of its execution. In their barracks, the enemy had been celebrating Christmas with rum and ale. As night came on, so did drunkenness, then sleep.
At Trenton, Washington had to try something new. Conventional military tactics had failed him. He remembered the guerrilla tactics of the Indians from the French and Indian War. So he and his men snuck up on the sleeping Hessian soldiers.
In the barracks, it was chaos. Outside, it was even worse.
Washington slipping across the Delaware, taking advantage of Hessians who had had too much to drink, surprising them in the morning and winning a very small victory, was not a great thing in military terms, but it was very important to the survival of the revolution.
Trenton was a psychological victory for America, for the troops, and for Washington himself. A week later, the British came after him with a vengeance. So did the calendar. When enlistments expired, Washington went before his troops and offered a bounty to all who would step forward and re-enlist.
The drums rolled. No one stepped forward. Washington couldn't believe it. He was dismayed. He was shocked. He was desperate. So he marched up and down the line, begging, pleading, cajoling his men to stay, telling them that the future of America rested with them. The drums rolled again. This time, one man stepped out, two men stepped out, and at the end, everyone who could stayed on.
He could lead. He could inspire his men. They admired him. He looked the picture of a general. He was a responsible, careful tactician. I don't suppose any military genius, but he had the genius to lead.
A few days later, he struck the British at Princeton.
What Washington did really well at Princeton was keep control of his men. He managed to dupe the British, leave his campfires burning, get his men off under cover of darkness, and surprise a very small and vulnerable portion of the British Army. That was quite an achievement.
You really see a victory that was the result of the force of Washington's will. Washington gallops to the front of his troops. His aides are appalled. Firing begins on both sides. There's so much smoke that nobody can see what's happening. His aides fully expect to find Washington dead.
But when the smoke cleared, Washington was still on his horse, and the British were on the retreat. He waved his hat and shouted, "It's a fine fox chase, my boys." And at that moment, George Washington became the American Revolution.